I think Night of the Living Dead was important in 1968 for really two reasons. One, just for what it represented to independent filmmakers, really showing that you could make a feature film outside of the Hollywood system or outside of New York. Really, regional filmmaking hadn't existed before this point at a feature film level. So, for that reason alone, that demonstration that perhaps you too could do this, I think is one of the key things that Night of the Living Dead will always be remembered for. But certainly as a horror film, the fact that 50 years later we're still talking about it, there's much more going on. To me, I find that one of the hallmarks of Night of the Living Dead that makes it memorable is the fact that, not unlike many films of the time, that by the end, whatever the menace, be it aliens from space or a giant insect, is defeated at the end of the film. And Night of the Living Dead, we're pretty much led to believe that the posse has things under control and everything's going to be okay. But our hero, who had survived through the night despite all odds, does not, and not at the hands of the undead ghouls that have been attacking, but as a result of the posse who are theoretically there to save him. And that punch in the gut is a bold move, not a commercial move from a filmmaking standpoint, and probably the number one reason why I think Night of the Living Dead still holds up to this day, because that powerful way in which the audience leaves the theater or ends the screening of the film, you can't help but think about it.
George took the conflict of the monster and created it, changed it to be more of people we know. We used to be scared by these monsters, these creations, stuff from outer space, but we were never afraid by people that used to be our neighbors, our friends, our loved ones. So George took that concept and really stripped it down and made it about humanity. George's conflict in Night of the Living Dead is basically a living versus living rather than a living versus dead scenario, because Ben and Harry Cooper are antagonizing each other more than the dead are, and they can't seem to get along. So with that type of struggle, that's what makes Night of the Living Dead effective, because it doesn't pitch you just against the living versus the dead. It's the living versus the living. And sometimes the living characters are the monsters more so than the living dead or the zombies or anything else, because they're the scariest ones, which is why Ben and Harry just can't get along. They can't put aside their differences because they both want to be right. And that type of storytelling is what George focused on in his films, and I felt that that's what helped make it successful.
Back in 1968, the film was certainly successful right out of the gate, but it wasn't a cultural landmark right off the bat. It didn't make that kind of splash initially. I remember having conversations with George where he said, it came out, it did the business in the drive-thrus they were, hoping for, and it returned money to the investors right away, but it kind of died off after that. It did its business and kind of went away. And then there was the whole snafu with the copyright being lopped off the film and it going into public domain, and everybody and their brother could get a 60 millimeter print of it and show it in a theater, and then later it could get distributed on video by countless different distributors. But it didn't really kind of pick up its cultural significance until, I really would say, about the mid-1970s, when it got rediscovered in a publication called Cahiers du Cinéma out in France. And it took a really hard, critical look at the film, and it was really the first one to kind of understand that Night of the Living Dead was really a landmark. It was such a reflection of the time in which it was made, and it had a lot of really progressive and very interesting things to say underneath the sort of story about zombies coming back from the dead, and underneath all that violence, that George Romero and those guys really had something to say. So it wasn't really until several years after that the film became, oh, that's an important film. I mean, it made a splash when it initially came out. The critics noted, some critics noted it, and they noted that the violence with the zombies eating the people, and then of course the fact that a black man was the lead in the film. There were certainly things that were noted about it at the time, but it wasn't until some time later, I would say a good probably 6 or 7 years, that the film became Night of the Living Dead, this important horror film. And its impact over the last 50 years has just gone up and up and up, to the point now where the genre just wouldn't exist. The genre that we know today, the horror genre that we know today, would not exist without Night of the Living Dead. And not just in terms of the zombies, in terms of the social commentary, in terms of the way that the film was made and put together. I mean, it changed so many different facets of cinema. And I think George in particular was always sort of, I don't necessarily think he poo-pooed the idea, or he kind of brushed it off, but I don't think even up until, shortly before he passed away, I don't know if he was ever really fully able to grasp just how much this film had become a part of pop culture and cinema itself. It's one of those things where the movie transcended itself. And you can't plan for that. These were just a bunch of guys who wanted to go make a movie, and they wanted to do the best possible job they could, and they wanted it to get seen by as many people as possible. And then they put their baby out there in the world, and look what happens. That's not something that you could ever design. It was never something that they could have predicted, but it happened.